Hello, everybody. My name is Karen Patrone, and I am the director of the Cooperative for the Humanities and Social Sciences of the College of Arts and Sciences here at UK. Our cooperative fosters interdisciplinary scholarly connections among faculty and grad students at UK, brings scholars together across departments, disciplines, and centers. We also facilitate faculty and graduate student engagement with our communities outside of UK at the national and local level. And we are demonstrating the value and the contributions of the humanities and social sciences in sustaining our communities and solving critical social problems. We welcome you tonight in our wonderful panel on the WPA as a model for arts in a crisis. What I'd like to do is very briefly introduce our panelists. Then from there, we will go ahead and allow each panelist approximately 10 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of opportunity for questions. And I will be monitoring the chat and allowing and asking your questions to the panelists. So we have a very distinguished panel tonight. Let me begin. I'm going to announce people in the order in which they will be speaking. And so we'll start off tonight with David Hamilton. David Hamilton teaches in the history department at the University of Kentucky and is a scholar of 20th century US political and policy history. He's the author of From New Day to New Deal, American Foreign Policy from Hoover to Roosevelt, and is particularly interested in the interwar era and the response to the Depression crisis. Then we have two speakers who are from the Department of Theater and Dance. Herman Farrell is a professor of theater and university research professor in the Department of Theater and Dance in the UK College of Fine Arts. He's an award-winning playwright and screenwriter and noted Eugene O'Neill scholar, and has been a member of several national arts organizations, including New Dramatists, the MacDowell Artist Colony, and the National Playwrights Conference of the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center. Farrell presented a paper on the Federal Theater Project last year at the University of Toulouse in France, and that paper will be published early next year in E Theatrum Mundi of the Sorbonne University Press. Next, we'll have Nancy Jones, who is a professor of theater at the University of Kentucky, where she teaches performance, directs productions, and brings an international resume of theater experience to the classroom. Moliere's Women, a play she wrote and directed, premiered in 2006 at the Mae West Festival in Seattle, Washington, and in Paris, France in July of 2007. Her work as a theater director has been featured in New York at the Lincoln Center Directors Lab, where she staged Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, and she has also appeared in as a theater director in New York and in many other venues at the University of Kentucky, across the United States, and in France. We hope that we'll have Ron Penn with us tonight. He appears to be having some technical difficulties, and we hope to be able to help him. Ron Penn is a professor emeritus at the University of Kentucky, where he was also the founding director of the John Jacob Niles Center for American Music. With research and performance interests in traditional Appalachian culture, his current activity is focused on writing a biography of Gene Ritchie and playing twisty old Kentucky mountain fiddle tunes. Our last speaker tonight will sort of bring us into the community, and that is Emily Moses, who's the executive staff advisor of the Kentucky Arts Council, which is the state's arts agency that is part of the Kentucky, yay, there's Ron, is part of the Kentucky Tourism, Artists, and Heritage Cabinet. She worked as an actress, journalist, and editor prior to beginning her work in state government 15 years ago. She graduated with a degree in journalism from Morehead State University, where she also studied theater. Emily lives in Cynthiana with her 2-year-old son. So we have a very distinguished panel ahead of us, and we are happily all assembled here. The one thing I wanted to mention was that this panel is also co-sponsored by the UK Appalachian Center, and we're very grateful to them for their support. And I am very much excited to hear what these wonderful panelists have to say. So we'll go ahead and start with David Hamilton.
Thank you, Karen. Good to be here with everyone. We are today inundated with opinion polls. I try not to check them more than 10 times a day lately. But that was hardly the case in 1939, when a newly created Gallup poll asked a sample of American voters a series of questions about Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And one of the questions was, what is the worst New Deal program? Followed by, what is the finest New Deal program? Now, there were a large number of possibilities. All these alphabet agencies that Roosevelt had been creating since 1933, but the results were not even close. Hands down, the poll respondents listed the worst agency as the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. Nor was it even close as to which agency was the finest. Once again, the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. Well, what was the WPA and why such conflicting responses? So the WPA was created in 1935, 2 years into the New Deal. Its mission was to reorganize and massively expand the New Deal's programs for relief of the unemployed and to provide forms of social assistance to those who could not be employed. It's best known for its work relief programs, or programs that sought to employ the jobless on building public works projects. It was created at a time when, of the nation's 127 million people, 11 million men and women were unemployed, 20% of the labor force. This was down from the 15 million out of work in 1933, but the number was still stunning, especially at a time when there was no unemployment insurance, no Social Security pensions, virtually no private or public health insurance. And this level of joblessness at a time when there were so few forms of social protection was more than an economic crisis. It was a social catastrophe that endangered families and communities, and in the minds of the New Dealers, even American democracy. The WPA was the New Deal's third major attempt to mitigate the Depression's misery and insecurity. It was also a vital part of what became New Deal liberalism, a governing ideology that reshaped relations between citizens and the national government, sought to democratize forms of economic security, and sought as well to democratize consumption. Consumption here broadly defined to include not just material goods, but access to education, healthcare, and cultural goods, or access to the arts. Now, the WPA lasted until 1943. And by that time, it had expended $13 billion. That was once a lot of money. Most of which was used to pay the wages of 8.5 million workers that it employed over those years. The workers were largely white men from both rural and urban America, but more so than any program of social provision in American history to that time, they also included women and African Americans, both men and women. The numbers hired in any given year range from a low of 1.6 million to a high of 3 million. Never were more than 2/5 of those who were unemployed able to work for the WPA, so it couldn't employ everyone. Wages ranged from $20 to $25 a month. By 1941, they had climbed to a whopping $60 a month. Over those 8 years, the WPA built nearly 600,000 miles of roads, 78,000 bridges, 125,000 public buildings, including 6,000 schools, 2,500 hospitals. In Kentucky, in early 1938, WPA employed 72,000 workers in a state with 2.7 million people. And these workers went about building roads, bridges, schools, plus laying mile after mile of sewer lines, some of which I suspect were just dug up with their renewal program here in Lexington. They helped rescue Louisville from the Great Flood of 1937. And yet, all told, this is one of the most successful programs of public works building in American history. And yet, we have this divided opinion. For many Americans, WPA stood for we piddle along, we poke along. WPA jobs were make-work jobs such as leaf raking. But to its supporters, WPA was a godsend. It meant work rather than the dole. It meant a heightened sense of self-respect. And years later, the record speaks for itself as the evidence of cities and counties with higher rates of WPA projects and employment at lower rates of sickness and higher issues and health issues, as well as lower rates of crime, family breakups, and suicides. In short, it had been instrumental in containing the Depression's horrific social devastation. This is what its administrator and creator, Harry Hopkins, the social worker, had wanted. Hopkins was a chain smoker, a divorced man, a driven, compulsive worker who seemed to live in a perpetually rumpled suit. He was an amazing combination of New Deal idealist and New Deal realist. Winston Churchill, some years later, would anoint him Lord Root of the Matter. And indeed, Churchill was quite right. For Hopkins, the root of the matter in the early 1930s was to spend money on relief, but no less important to sustain the self-respect of those clobbered by the Depression. And he felt that direct relief, cash payments, in-kind payments of groceries would stigmatize, would demean, work relief would not. But Hopkins did something more. He went beyond simply employing the jobless to build schools and roads. He dared to have the WPA engage in a bold effort to produce culture. He put musicians and singers to work in orchestras and choral groups, actors, stagehands, and directors in theatrical companies. He hired mural and easel artists, not he himself, but his WPA, stagehand sculptors and printmakers to produce works of art, writers, researchers, historians, and librarians to write about and document America, catalog historical documents, collect the untold stories of men and women who had almost always been ignored or slighted in American history, such as the ex-slaves or the freed peoples after the Civil War. The WPA hired men and women to teach music and art to children and adults in community centers and schools across the nation. He did this by creating the 4 programs of Federal One, the arts programs, one for the arts, one for writers, one for theater, one for music. This was a small part of the WPA, less than 2% of its budget, employing about 40 or 50,000 people, but it became a huge part of the public face of the WPA, and historical appraisals amount to a small mountain of research of these programs. So why do this? Hopkins' glib answer was, hell, they've got to eat just like other people. He also said that if the Depression continued for very long, a generation of artists would be lost and a fatal blow would be dealt to American culture. But in addition, for Harry Hopkins, the New Deal was about enlarging the possibilities of American life and the lives of the American people, providing jobs where there were none to be had, building what was needed, badly needed to improve lives, building infrastructure that would serve the nation for decades, but also embracing the cause of creating a public art and a more democratic culture, one that could be shared by all classes, all regions, all races. This was bold, experimental, imaginative, daring. It was also controversial. And these programs did much to arouse the opposition and the suspicion of the WPA. Perhaps as a WPA program, Federal One was a bit of New Deal overreach. Was it possible for a relief program to engage in the production of new forms of culture? After all, these people were unemployed writers and artists and musicians. Were they the ones to be doing this? Hopkins thought so, but perhaps not. Could these programs be innovative and experimental while also celebrating the American past? Could they be free of censorship as government programs? Was art to be a weapon in refashioning conceptions of the American way? All of these are questions that perhaps we can take up as we move on, but these arts programs were part of this larger mission of Hopkins WPA to enlarge the possibilities of American life. And in this sense, they represent, along with Hopkins himself in many ways, the very best of the New Deal. I'll stop there, thanks.
Thank you, David, for that very beautifully done and right on time overview. Thank you. So next we're going to move from the program at large to the Federal Theater Project, and we'll turn to Herman Farrell.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to see if I can switch over to the screen. Can everybody see that? Okay. I guess people can kind of control where their boxes are. Yep. So just picking up from where Professor Hamilton left off, with regard to the arts projects, there were 4 of them. There was the Federal Music Project, the Writers Project, the Art Project, and the Federal Theater Project. And I'm going to be spending time focusing on the Federal Theater Project, and my colleague Nancy Jones will be doing so as well. What's interesting to note about the project itself is that it had as its director, as you can see here in this image, Hallie Flanagan. She was from Vassar College. She was the head of the experimental theater there. I'm an alum of Vassar and actually worked in a theater that was named after her. But she had gone to Grinnell College, gone to Harvard for her master's, and then quickly was hired at Vassar. And then after doing that, work there doing experimental work and spending some time actually in Europe and studying the modern dramatists. She established a real cool drama department in Poughkeepsie. And the interesting point about that is that it wasn't that far from New Hyde Park, where Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt lived. And so there was that connection. So when the time came for them to look for someone to run the Federal Theater Project, Eleanor, I believe, is the one who suggested that Hallie Flanagan should take it on. So Hallie Flanagan went to Washington, D.C. and met with Harry Hopkins, as well as Eleanor Roosevelt at the White House. And Eleanor Roosevelt said, I hope that you'll take this opportunity to expand our sort of national culture. A lot of the things that were just mentioned by Dr. Hamilton. And then when she got to Harry Hopkins, he reminded her of the politics of the situation, that the big thing here was that it was work relief and her job was to employ as many people as possible. And so she took both of those notes and went forward from there. And that was 1935. One thing quickly to note is that the FTP only lasted 4 years, not until 43, but until 39. And I'll talk in a moment as to why the Federal Theater Project was abolished rather suddenly, and it was because of politics and backlash. But just to get started again with the notion of her objectives when she took on the job, as you see there on the slide, it says that she had a ratio of 90 to 10, and it basically meant that 90% of her hires had to be, and her money had to be spent towards labor, period. And the other 10% would be dedicated to everything else, like production and any other administrative costs. But it was all supposed to be funding the artists. And the artists that were funded, according to records from 1936, which is sort of right in the middle of the 1 year into it, there were 11,000 artists that were employed through the Federal Theater Project. But interestingly enough, in that same year, 15 million people saw shows that were presented by the Federal Theater Project. So the Federal Theater Project, when it was set up by her, under her aegis, she worked out of New York City and went back and forth to Washington, D.C., was broken up to be a real true federal system. The notion that she embraced was the idea that there should be a kind of a national theater. She'd been talking about this for years, but there should be regional support and sort of notions of the federalism that you would go out to the regions and cities and get them to develop their own work and hopefully have them develop what is sort of a national identity. She was multicultural in her approach. She made sure that there were folks who were from a variety of different cultures, including the African-American community. as well as a Yiddish theater, as well as a Cuban-American theater. And so she had a real dedication to that kind of notion of multiculturalism back in the 1930s. And then she was just interested in a diversity of approaches to what would be presented: vaudeville, puppetry, children's theater, and this thing known as the living newspaper. And we'll get to that in a moment. Let me see. So the first federal, she held a summer theater conference, and this was the focus of my research. I won't spend a lot of time focusing on this, but I will just bring up this conference that she held in 1937, which was smack dab in the middle of her tenure she didn't know it was halfway through, and she called this the first federal summer theater conference, and she was hoping it would be more than just one theater conference. But at this conference that was held at Vassar College, with a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation and funding from the WPA, she really thought that it would be important to bring a variety of different artists, and she brought in basically 42 people from across the country, from those regional companies, from those diverse companies, to come together to basically work on one, quality improvement. There was a big thing here was that a lot of artists, just like right now, where Broadway has been shut down for, it's going to be almost a year by the time it reopens, a lot of artists are not working. And so she felt like it was important to start thinking about the new innovations that are available and how folks could be trained during this time period. So they were being introduced to new technologies, but also she was interested in experimentation, giving them sort of a sense of what she knew as a director and as a student of theater history in terms of what was happening worldwide. But she also wanted to foster a conversation, a regional and national conversation about how theater can kind of be effective during this time period. So when she went into this conference in the summer of 1937, already controversy was starting to face them. The first big thing is at the bottom of the slide, which is that there was budget cuts. And they were given, within 2 years of it, they were told by Congress that they had to cut their budget by 20%. So she had all these basically leaders of the regions coming in, and a lot of them weren't going to lose their jobs, but they were going to have to hand out pink slips to their folks working in these various regions. So that was one sort of downside of what was happening. And one could argue that probably the reason why this was happening right about 1937 was because of two controversial productions that had been produced by the Federal Theater Project. The first one is Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here, which is, let's call it what it is, an Antifa play. It was an anti-fascist play and novel about the notion of what could happen if America was overtaken by fascists. It's a fascinating novel, and it was dramatized by Sinclair Lewis and then produced all across the country in October of 36, and then even done locally in the following year. The Cradle Will Rock was also a controversial narrative. There's a movie that was done about this, and it's about basically it's a rock opera, but it's an opera that's basically trying to address the issues of the social situation in America, notably the employment situation. It was considered to be very controversial, and there was an attempt to shut it down. And this was just on the eve of this conference. And the movie, if you ever get a chance to see it, talks about how they persevered by putting on the production when they were not allowed to do it. And they did it in another theater in New York. It's a whole long story, but I'm not going to go off on that. But the other thing to talk about with regard to the summer conference is that there was this opportunity for retraining. These images show you those images from 1937. Flanagan gave lectures on experimentation. She was an expert on the difference between realism and expressionism and constructivism. They had guest performances coming in from a variety. They went and saw a production at Bennington, but then they also had a group come in from the Dance Project, which was sort of a subset of the Federal Theater Project, and they did their own production at Vassar, and to give people a new way of seeing theater. These were sort of movement-based theaters and more abstract. And then the last thing that they did was they actually put on a production of this living newspaper play called 1/3 of a Nation. The living newspaper was established by the Newspaper Guild. There are a lot of out-of-work writers who were wanting to dramatize their ideas and address sort of the issues of the New Deal through the power of theater. They had written, speaking of the word power, they had written a hit show just just moments before they came up to the conference called Power, which was about the TVA and about the Tennessee Valley Authority and the New Deal opportunities to bring electrification to the Southeast region. And they did this, they wanted to do this play, and they did do it at Vassar, called 1/3 of a Nation. And it was about the housing crisis. And here's just some images of the production itself and the work that they did. And what was really fascinating was all these folks who were not necessarily theater actors or directors or what have you. They were all in to actually produce this show on the stage at the end of the summer, and they were there for 6 weeks. And so it was a real triumph. And as you can see from this image, Eleanor Roosevelt showed up for it. She attended it. There were positive reviews as a result of it. It ended up going back to New York in its full version and created as a Broadway production that then went around the country. So just, I know I'm approaching my time, but just two more things that I want to just bring up. One is her valedictory address. When she was speaking to everybody who was attending the conference on the last day, she basically said, Hallie Flanagan said, "We've been given a chance to help change America at a time when 20 million unemployed Americans prove that it needs changing. And the theater, when it's any good, can change things. The theater can quicken, start things, make things happen. Don't be afraid when people tell you this is a play of protest. Of course it's protest. It's a protest against dirt, disease, human misery. Harry Hopkins is protesting, as President Roosevelt is protesting against some of the evils of this country of ours." And again, I think this is a real, really interesting comment in our current state of play in terms of how we're perceiving protest. And she wanted to push back against the pushback against protest plays, and to say there's a place for it, especially now in our culture. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but we'll talk a little about this at some point, maybe in the Q&A. But basically, there was a lot of backlash against the FTP, and one could argue that it was unfair. One thing, like with regard to that production of 1/3 of a Nation, they were criticizing it as socialist propaganda. Sounds familiar. And basically all they were calling for was fair housing laws. There was a line throughout the play where somebody would criticize the current state of play in the housing world, which was basically domination by the wealthy and the landlords and maltreatment of all tenants. And people in these scenes would cry out, there ought to be a law. There ought to be a law like that says that there needs to be adequate lighting and plumbing and a variety of other things that suddenly became part of our vernacular because of this play and because of fair housing laws that Roosevelt was advocating for during the New Deal. But because of that, it made enemies, and the enemies in particular were a variety of churches and landlords. A lot of the churches during this time period were the landlords that were being criticized by name. They were actually being called out. And the last part of this is that the Federal Theater Project was summarily dismissed in 1939. Hallie Flanagan was brought before what was called the Dias Committee, which then would later be called the House Un-American Activities Committee. But in that committee, she was questioned about her trip to Russia, because she had gone to Russia in 1927 as part of that research, and a variety of other things, and attacks on the programming, and basically calling it a communist front or a socialist front. And immediately, literally overnight, the Federal Theater Project was shut down. And then she spent the next few years doing her best to kind of turn things around and do her best to at least tell the story. And we could talk a little bit more about how they erased it. Last thing I'll share with you on the screen is the impact. The legacy of the Federal Theater Project is the National Endowment of the Arts, which kicked up in '65, was sort of modeled after a lot of the notions that were coming out of FTP and Works Progress Administration, state art agencies, not-for-profit corporations, off-Broadway, regional theater, community theater, a variety of different organizations, as well as a variety of different conferences, all sort of have taken their lead from what happened in the Federal Theater Project. I have a slide that focuses on things that we can kind of consider in this conversation, but I know I've gone well over my time period, Karen, so thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you very much. That was a fascinating presentation, and maybe we can come back to your questions. Maybe we could put up that slide when we get to the question and answer part. All right, thank you. So next we have Nancy Jones, who's going to bring it local for us.
Right. Okay. So, all right. So as Karen said, I am going to telescope in and talk about the impact of the Federal Theater Project here in our region. And as has been said by both Herman and David, that the FTP was a relief project, and the rationale for creating a unit in your city or region was that you needed to have enough out-of-work actors in that place to validate having a unit. So while there weren't enough out-of-work actors or performers in Kentucky, there were plenty in Ohio, just to the north of us. And so in fact, Ohio had not just a unit in Cincinnati, but also one in Dayton, Toledo, Columbus, Cleveland, and Cincinnati. Of course, Cincinnati, and I won't go into this in any detail, but this is part of my bigger article that I'm also writing for the Sorbonne Press, as Herman is. But Cincinnati had a rich history of performance that was established in the 19th century, as it was one of the 10th largest cities in the country, due to its shipping and position at the Ohio River. So Cincinnati was well equipped to handle a federal theater project unit, but about 6 months into the FTP, only Cleveland and Cincinnati were left. Cleveland mainly focused on children's theater by that point, and Cincinnati really took over as the state representative for adult plays and performance and vaudeville. They were they had 2 vaudeville units as well. So as you can see from this slide, this is the list of productions that happened in Cincinnati from April 13th, 1936 to its end in May 1939. There are a total of 34 productions, and in 3 years that amounts to just over 1 production per month. So as a theater director, I look at this list and I start to shiver and sweat because it's unfathomable the amount of work that was produced in this unit. And I am going to talk about not all of these productions, but 3 that I think are the most iconic and the most influential in the success of the Cincinnati Theater Project, the Federal Theater Project in Cincinnati. So the 3 were Hms Pinafore, that happened in 36. It Can't Happen Here, which Herman has already alluded to, that happened in 37. And its production of Macbeth, which I can say because I'm at home and not in the theater, and that happened in 39. So I'm going to start with this production of Hms Pinafore, which is really quite delightful. The set for this production was constructed out at a park it's adjacent to UC and just near the Cincinnati Zoo, a place called the Burnett Woods. This is a man-made lake, and the set for the Hms Pinafore, which is a ship, was constructed on pontoons on this lake. And you can see from this slide how they built this wonderful stage right on the lake. This was conceived by a man named Ted Hahn. Ted Hahn was the director for both the Cincinnati Theater and Music Project at this point. And because of his background as a professional musician, he was a theater orchestra director, he knew all the musicians in town. And so he was able to draw on that kind of collaboration to help pull this thing off. It was a massive undertaking. He used local carpenters, people donated wood, various other units from the WPA and the Federal One collaborated as well. Artists made the posters. Musicians, as I said, were in the orchestra, and they were in the chorus. And of course, we had actors from the theater project. And this is the set being built. And this is what it looks like when it was fully constructed. You can see it was, a cast of thousands. The play happened, it started at dusk, and you can see that the orchestra had an orchestra pit built for them on the set. And it went well into nightfall when the footlights illuminated it on the stage. So this was really a big starting point for the Cincinnati FTP. And it was so influential, in fact, that prior to this, the theater unit was kind of seen as amateurish. But the newspaper, the Inquirer, sent out a female reporter. Nobody else would take the gig. So she went out and she embedded herself as a chorine for the evening in one of the shows, in one of the performances. And in the article in the Inquirer, she talks about a woman that she's sitting next to at her, getting her makeup applied before the show was about to begin. And she's sort of tongue-in-cheek about the whole thing, kind of, she considers it a lark. But she turns to the woman next to her and she recognizes her. And she says to her, "What, you're here? What, you're doing this show?" And the woman says, and she says, "Because I remembered at that moment that although she had been married and her husband and her life had started out quite well, the husband had died very, very just instantaneously. And she was left without any way to support herself or her small children." And this woman turned to her and said, "Yes, I'm in it." She said, "Remember, I was a singer, and boy, am I happy to be here. This show has changed my family's life." So in this moment of sort of tongue-in-cheek, what is this thing? Is it any, does it have any real value? The reporter added that anecdote to her review and had a big impact on how the citizenry saw the FTP and its influence, not just as entertainment, but as a real social program. So Pinafore was a big hit. They did a couple more, they did many other operettas because of Ted Hahn's background, but they also did plays. Several months later, they were getting set to produce, as Herman mentioned, It Can't Happen Here. As he said, based on the novel by Sinclair Lewis, a play about rising fascism in Europe, and can you imagine a demagogue as president? And so this play, we need to get that on our season at some point, I think. But this play was scheduled to be done all over the country, as Herman mentioned, a huge undertaking by Hadley Flanagan, 20 productions all over the country, including Cleveland and Cincinnati. Unfortunately, the Cincinnati production, which was scheduled to open in January, was cut short, or actually interrupted, because of the Ohio flood, which was also mentioned earlier. Of course, nobody was thinking about a play when the flood hit, and the city was plunged into darkness. The floodwaters continued to rise for weeks, and at that time, Hadley Flanagan writes about this in her book Arena. The vaudeville units and other theater folk from the FTP rowed out in boats to stranded citizens of Cincinnati, families, children, people with nothing, and performed for them wherever they could find them. And they stole the hearts of the community. They gave them a momentary respite from the horrors of their everyday life. And when the floodwaters finally receded, they produced It Can't Happen Here several weeks later than they had originally intended, but it was so popular by that point that they actually returned it due to popular demand for an extra week's performances. And that too got a rave review in the Cincinnati Enquirer. And finally, by this time, the FTP is considered a professional endeavor by the citizens of Cincinnati. The last project I would like to talk about, and I know I'm running out of time too. That play was done at the Emory Theater, and the Emory was an auditorium built by the philanthropist Mary Emory, housed in the Ohio Mechanics Institute. This is you cannot get into this theater anymore. It's still there, but it's abandoned, sadly. And but that's where the FTP did all their plays. So it's this massive hall, it seats 2,500. It wasn't really conducive to experimental or intimate theater. although they did quite well with operettas and bigger, more dramatic shows. But by this time, they were looking for a space that was more intimate, and they moved from the Emory down to the Playbox Theater. The building is still there. It's on Race Street in Cincinnati. It was a photo studio, and they managed to convince the landlord to transform it into a small theater for them. By this time, Franklin Raymond was the director of the Cincinnati FTP. He was also the Ohio State director, and he participated in the summer workshop that Herman mentioned. And he staged his first show very experimentally in this space. He did a production of Macbeth. And he used all the constructs that he learned and was inspired by Hallie Flanagan's summer workshop, including this constructivist set that he helped to inspire and design. The costumes, which he took great pride in using local artisans and workers in collaborating on this. And you can see from the little costume of Macduff, he took great pride in the fact that he got the skins for those costumes for $1 per skin. He wanted to play up all the supernatural elements of the witches because he knew that his audience was not familiar with Shakespeare. So he cut the piece way down, made it super exciting, and did a Macbeth that he knew would be very popular in Cincinnati. And in doing so, those are just 3 examples of the types of plays that were collaborative, not just between artists, but they also engaged the community. They were ultimately very creatively inspired, and he made them cost effective. The HMS Pinafore out on the lake was free of charge. 75,000 people saw that play, including the 10,000 that came opening night. 5,000 had to be turned away. They were hanging from the trees trying to get a glimpse of that play. So they made theater in the FTP something that was not only affordable, but it was relevant for the citizens. They continued to change and evolve throughout their tenure to make sure that that was true. Am I on time?
Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. So we are now going to, oh, okay, great. We're now moving into the more into the present. We're going to turn to music, and we're going to hear about the past and the present with Ron Penn. Ron?
Thank you. Such a pleasure to be in your company here. Then and now. First the then. Extreme economic distress. 12 million people out of work. A slow recovery from the horror of the Spanish flu pandemic that infected 500 million people. Political instability, labor strikes, civic disorder. With the United States mired in the Great Depression, President Roosevelt stated that the American dream was the promise not only of economic and social justice, but also of cultural enrichment. Consequently, he enacted a New Deal program, Federal One, in July of 1935. The program included 5 arts projects, including the Federal Music Project, the first one where federal money was allocated to culture, precursor of the 1965 founding of the NEA and NEH. Dr. Nikolai Sokolov was appointed the director of the Federal Music Project. Sokolov had been conductor for the original Cleveland Orchestra from 1919 to 1933, an extended tenure there. While he was a highly respected professional musician, his notion of music was strongly dictated, the role of the Federal Music Project, which was centered on providing employment and support for classical music performers and conductors, copyists, composers, and enhancing music appreciation education. Sokolov's narrow musical vision did not extend to the approval of popular or vernacular folk expression. According to Sokolov, jazz and swing did not represent popular music at all. Popular music is music that endures through the years, as Handel's Messiah and the Fifth Symphony of Beethoven. That's popular music. I bet more people today in the world know the Fifth Symphony, and it was written 100 years ago. Sokolov's bias was addressed somewhat in 1938 by the addition of Charles Seeger as a deputy director. Seeger, a founding member of the American Musicological Society and the Society for Ethnomusicology, was concerned with making music accessible to everyone. The father of a musical family that included his wife, composer Ruth Crawford, and children Pete, Peggy, Penny, and Mike Seeger. He was involved in research on traditional American musical culture, what was mostly called folk music at the time. From the beginning of the FMP, there was a tension between the Eurocentric art music direction of Sokolov and the common man ideology of the New Deal. Seeger, along with scholar musicians such as John and Alan Lomax, John Harrington Cox, Margaret Valiant, Sidney Robertson Cowell, and Herbert Halpert, focused on documenting traditional music expression, collecting ballads, folk song, dance, former slave narratives, and oral history. Whereas the FMP was largely about music, a more interdisciplinary group was formed, the Joint Committee on Folk Arts, on December 16, 1938, dedicated to all the oral, popular, and traditional materials that express ways of living in our country. B.A. Botkin, the National Folklore Director for the Federal Writers Project, was named as the chair, and Seeger was appointed vice chair. The Joint Committee was all about social purpose. As Alan Lomax said in a later interview, quote, "The incredible thing was when you could play this material back for people, it changed everything for them. They were just as good as anybody else." National identity was being negotiated as Americans were buffeted by the parade of cataclysms, World War I, the Depression, and World War II. The Federal Music Project successfully supported elite music and musicians performing the timeless Bach, Brahms, and Beethoven, while the smaller Joint Committee on Folk Arts respected the voice of American people, amateur vernacular musicians. Although the Archive of American Folk Song, now the American Folklife Center of the Library of Congress, was founded a few years earlier in 1928, it was during the WPA era that collection expanded exponentially under the leadership first of Lomax and then Botkin. At the same time, the Federal Music Project celebrated art music culture. By the time the WPA music program was terminated in 1943, thousands of jobless musicians were employed. Orchestras were founded and supported. Music was commissioned, composed, published, and circulated to libraries. Public school music education was vastly expanded, and performances were made available, most of which were free to the public. But we still regarded Europe as the font of culture. Now, extreme economic distress, 30 million out of work, mired in the COVID pandemic that has affected somewhere between 8 and 9 million, political instability, and civic disorder. The pandemic has stilled the voice of music. Live performances have largely ceased since March. Broadway and the Met are dark, orchestras shuttered, clubs closed, musicians are out of work, and the few music performances that take place are mostly online, just like this, another Zoom concert. Is this the time for a new federal music project? What would it look like? Let me examine just one small project located at Hindman, Kentucky. Hindman, with a population of 700, most of which is strung out along Troublesome Creek like pearls on a necklace, is the county seat of Knott County in the southeast corner of the Commonwealth. It has been ravaged by the decline of the coal industry. There are no businesses left in town, save for a few fast food joints, gas stations, law offices, and the courthouse. Even the bank and most of the churches have moved out of town. Because of its poverty, coupled with its heritage, in 2013, it was the recipient of a $11 million Target of Opportunity grant during Governor Paul Patton's administration. According to the rather New Dealish support, the Appalachian Artisan Center was created in the old Boland building on the main street. An arts incubator with studios was located in the old Cody department store building. The Hazard Community College completed a gorgeous renovation of the old high school and equipped it with state-of-the-art equipment for a school of craft. A small outdoor pavilion was created as a public performance space. Unfortunately, the infrastructure of the town and its relative isolation did not support the innovations designed to create a model Appalachian artisanal culture center. They wanted this to be a real place where the arts were an economic engine. The School of Craft never drew the expected students. The Artisan Center displayed lovely local crafts and arts, but few people traveled to see them or bought them when they did visit. But then the luthier came to town. The Artisan Center supported a fledgling luthier created by master guitar maker Doug Naselrode. At first, the luthier was focused on recreating traditional dulcimers. From the late 19th century, Heinemann had been the center of the Appalachian dulcimer with noted craftspeople, such as Uncle Ed Thomas, McKinley Craft, and Will Singleton. The Heinemann Settlement School, founded as the first rural settlement school in 1902, developed a thriving industry as Jethro Ambergy directed a dulcimer making workshop staffed by students. Gene Ritchie introduced the dulcimer to the world at large, and Heinemann Settlement School sent those dulcimers all over the world. Soon the luthier was building guitars, mandolins, and ukuleles. The shop was beginning to attract notice. And then in 2012, a recovering addict and felon, Earl Moore, entered the shop. He asked about learning the trade. Doug was more than willing to teach him until Earl told him that he couldn't pass a drug test. Doug took a chance on Earl, though, and the culture of recovery was born. Broken former addicts were transformed into skilled and engaged artisans, crafting musical instruments of native wood. Doug took the next step and created the Troublesome Creek String Instrument Company in the renovated School of Craft that had been sitting there gathering dust bunnies. The success story continued to mushroom, and the New York Times, CNN, Forbes, and all features on the Troublesome Creek String Instrument Company.
Ron,
Investment in the arts had created in ruins, beset by a pandemic of, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Am I tracking again?
You were breaking up a little bit. And so I was wondering, maybe, is your video off, or you might turn your video off?
No, it's a satellite connection. So it's
okay.
sometimes a little iffy.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe if you turn your video off for a few minutes, you'd be able to be clearer.
Is it okay now, or should I try that?
It's okay.
Okay. So Doug created the Troublesome Creek String Instrument Factory in the renovated School of Craft that had been gathering dust. The New York Times, CNN, NPR, and Forbes all did large feature stories on the company. Investment in the arts created a thriving art scene where an economy by a pandemic of opioid addiction could finally claim success as the local court, in league with Hickory Hill Recovery Center and the Troublesome Creek String Instrument Company, transformed convicts into skilled artists. The natural resources of Knott County were a lifetime of generations of musicians. The town of Hyman has regained some human activity in the decayed center of town. And this small oasis of arts and culture can provide a model for federal and state investment in the arts at a time when there is extreme COVID pandemic that has infected somewhere between 8 and 9 million. Political and key to this is, I think, the same as FDR's New Deal. Work, creating work for people instead of investing in training and education and work rather than simply paying out welfare. So a small test case. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron, for sharing that with us. I'm really, excited with the shape of the way this is moving from the past into the present with practical suggestions. And now we're going to turn to Emily Moses. Emily.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks for having me on the panel this evening. I'd like to start by giving you some information about the arts and culture sector in the United States and in Kentucky. In the United States, the total number of arts and cultural jobs for the nation was 5.1 million in 2017. Those figures are from the Arts and Cultural Production Satellite Account produced by the U.S. Department of Commerce Bureau of Economic Analysis. Now, during that year, arts and cultural economic activity accounted for 4.5% of the U.S. gross domestic product, and that's about $877.8 billion with a B dollars. In 2018, the latest year for which there is data available in Kentucky, there were 95,269 creative jobs in the Commonwealth. This includes full-time, part-time, and freelance, or what we often refer to as gig workers. These are the people in Kentucky whose work makes up the creative industry. Those jobs account for $2.3 billion in industry earnings in Kentucky. So you realize when we start talking about the creative industry or the arts in the United States, we're talking about a sector that includes a lot of people. And those, of course, for those of us who work in the arts and live anywhere in Kentucky, know that those are people just like you and me. I think it's fair at this point to say every person's life in the United States and globally has shifted in some way due to the pandemic we're currently living through. And for many of us, the way we work has been significantly affected. However, the arts and culture sector has been affected more so than others. The Brookings Institution, which recently analyzed the creative industry in the United States and the effects on it from COVID-19, estimates losses of 2.7 million jobs and more than $150 billion in sales of goods and services for creative industries nationwide. That represents nearly a third of all jobs in the industry and 9% of annual sales. The fine and performing arts industries will be hit hardest, suffering estimated losses of almost 1.4 million jobs and 42.5 billion in sales. Those estimated losses represent 50% of all jobs in those industries and more than a quarter of all lost sales nationwide. So again, 50% of an industry is the estimated loss. It's staggering. It's important to note a loss of revenue for local arts organizations can't only be viewed as a loss of profit. It's a loss of the funds that provide paychecks for artists, staff members, and contract workers. So what has been the government's response to date? Well, earlier this year, Congress appropriated $75 million to the National Endowment for the Arts through the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security, that's CARES Act, to preserve jobs and help support organizations forced to close due to the spread of COVID-19. 40% of this funding was awarded directly to state and regional arts agencies like the Kentucky Arts Council to distribute through their funding programs. Here, the Kentucky Arts Council awarded more than $400,000 of CARES Act funds to 81 nonprofit arts organizations across the state. These funds could be used for salaries and other operating costs like mortgages or rent and utilities. This funding was and is extremely important for a sector that many expect will be affected by these closures long after full recovery and reopening begins in other sectors. The Kentucky Arts Council was affected by COVID early in the crisis. In fact, we were the first art show in Kentucky to be canceled due to COVID. In mid-March, we were at the Kentucky Horse Park setting up for our annual Kentucky Crafted Market, an annual wholesale and retail showcase we've produced for more than 35 years, when we received the call to shut down our show. In the weeks that followed, we responded to an increasingly severe situation for the artists and organizations we serve by providing resources to artists and arts organizations about funding opportunities, emergency grants, and other important informational resources that are needed in the field at this time. For the first time, gig workers, artists of all kinds, nonprofit workers, and others were eligible to apply for unemployment assistance made available by the state. Many of the visual and craft and performing artists we work with through our programs have had their entire year's worth of shows canceled. And many cancellations have already begun for 2021. While we have been able to create some opportunities for artists to find new revenue streams, we know there is nothing we can do to replace the sales and performance opportunities they expected for the entire year. The same goes for the state's nonprofit arts organizations, especially those who produce performing arts who have not and will not be able to reopen anytime soon. So what's coming up that may help artists and organizations? Well, that's the big question. And I know there are a lot of people in the industry who are waiting to see. One thing that is very promising is Americans for the Arts, which is a national advocacy organization for creative workers and artists, has proposed a plan with 15 action items that they hope the next administration will utilize to help put creative workers back to work, rebuilding, reimagining, unifying, and healing communities in every state and territory, as well as within tribal lands. You can see that plan at the Americans for the Arts website, and after I am finished talking, I will also drop it in the chat for you. In closing, I want to share a few things that you can also do right now if you're so inclined to help the arts community. First, stay up to date about what's going on with the arts. Join an advocacy group like Americans for the Arts. In Kentucky, you can also look into joining Kentuckians for the Arts, which is a newer state-based organization that is focused on advocating for the arts and artists in the Commonwealth. You can find them on Facebook, Kentuckians for the Arts. Make your voice heard. Write or call your elected officials and tell them about your support for the arts and artists in Kentucky and nationally. Urge them to provide funding and support to this sector, not just at the federal level, but at the state and local level too. Support your local arts organizations. There are organizations across the state that need support. The holidays are on the horizon, and if you're the type of person who likes to donate in honor of your friends and loved ones as gifts, consider making that donation to an arts organization. You can also find ways to support Kentucky artists. We have a directory of individual fine art and craft artists, as well as performers and other artists on our website. These are the artists who are living and working in Kentucky today. Many of them have websites or would be happy to talk with you one-on-one about commissions and sales. I'm going to drop a couple of links, extra links in the chat that will take you right to those pages. We also have a partnership with a for-profit organization called Entrepreneur, which is a fine art and craft sales platform. Many of our artists are selling on that platform right now. And there's a page on our website where you can see the participants and find everybody's direct links to their sites. I'll put that in the chat for you. Thanks for inviting me to participate, Karen. And if anyone is interested in talking further or would like any of these numbers sent to you, I'm also going to put my email address in the chat. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the, sort of the really set of very concrete things and steps that we can do. Thank you so much. I appreciate your putting things in the chat as well. So my next question is to open it up to my next plan is to open it up to questions. And there is a Q&A mechanism. I'm afraid we won't be able to call on people vocally, but if you put a question in the Q&A, we will address it. Please let us know who you want to speak to, or who you want to answer the question. And if you want, Herman, if you want to put up your set of questions for consideration, this might be a good time to do that.
Is that visible?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Is it fully visible? Or am I on the right page?
Yeah, it's okay. It's good.
Okay. So the key thing is, one of the things I would, sort of propose is that we, going back to the comment that Emily made that's coming from the Americans for the Arts, is this notion of rebuilding and reimagining. I mean, I think the Federal Theater Project was at a moment in American history where there was a lot of opportunities to rethink how to do things. Even the adoption of the notion of federal or national support or state support for the arts was brand new. It was being done in Europe and never been tried in America. It was knocked it was eliminated in 43, but then it comes back in 65 under the new society, under the Great Society programs. Basically, one of the things I think maybe we want to think about when we go back, when that time comes, is of course continuing the federal and state support for the arts. One of the things that's popped up during this conversation, I know in the theater community, is about representation and about the arts organizations themselves and the way they've been structured. And so there's been a lot of concerns, especially in the Black community, as folks who were involved with Black Lives Matter, about even sort of the empowerment of African-American voices, Latino voices, as well from the LGBTQ community, about their voices being heard within these arts administrations, so these arts organizations. So I think that's going to be very much on the table when we go back, is when we build back better. The question is, how do we do that, and who's invited back into these arts organizations? One of the things I think we might want to think about is returning to artist grants. It's like, are we going to have direct artist grants as opposed to money going directly to arts organizations? That became controversial in the 1990s because of the Mapplethorpe and a variety of other different controversies surrounding artists that were considered to be problematic for some people getting grants. But maybe we need to consider going back to that as a way of fueling the economy, but also really supporting as many artists as possible directly. And then this notion of the artist staff ratio that was raised as a 90-10 notion under the Federal Theater Project. Rocco Landesman, who was the head of the NEA in 2011, criticized what was going on, that the ratio had completely flipped, and you're at about a 3-to-1 ratio with three people on staff versus one artist for every dollar. And that's really, it can't and it shouldn't be allowed to go that way. And then just thinking about maybe artist-driven organizations rather than foundation-driven organizations, thinking about the not-for-profit corporation model itself, maybe partnerships and collectives can be taken into consideration. When we go back into whatever buildings that maybe, if we're living in a COVID world for a very long time, what do we think about the architecture in terms of spreading out not only the audience, but also the backstage space for artists so that they can work with each other safely should this ever pop up again. And then just this last thing about once the theaters have reopened, and it's an interesting line from Shakespeare in Love. If you've seen it, the movie, it's a beautiful moment. It's a moment when after the second plague that Shakespeare had to deal with, had shut down the theaters for almost a year and they're reopened. It's a beautiful moment when someone's walking through the street saying the theaters are open. I get choked up thinking about it because so many of my friends are unemployed during this time period and out of work. But when the theaters do reopen, I think there's going to be a lot of stories that are going to be told because of COVID. And a lot of artists I know are digging in and doing the work of literally writing stories, not only about COVID, but about a variety of other things that we're sort of dealing with. And I think when we go forward, that's one of the things that will come out of this, just as it did during the crisis of the Depression. Art was created and inspired as a result of the crisis. So those are my list of stuff.
Thank you. Oops. Yeah, I'm in. Wasn't sure I was muted or not. Thank you. So we are open for questions. Please write your question in the question and answer box. We have some shy audience today. That's interesting. Huh. I'm wondering if the question and answer is open. You could also put them in the chat, I think. Oh, I think I saw a, did I see a question?
Maybe they're putting them in the Q&A now.
No? Okay, well, I'll start off with a question in that case. While we're waiting for folks to, I thought the panel was incredibly stimulating, so I would hope that we would get some more questions. Maybe there's some kind of technical glitch. But I have a question about the living newspaper. This is related to Hallie Flanagan going to the Soviet Union. Okay, we have a question too. You know what, why don't I'll put my question on hold and go ahead and ask this question first, and then we can always come back to me later. So this is from Melanie Goen, our colleague in history. And she writes, I think the beauty of New Deal's support of the arts projects is that it had the dual purpose of providing wages, but also encouraging stronger communities. COVID presents a different set of circumstances since we can't come together physically to enjoy art. How can we find creative ways to still accomplish both of these worthy goals in this unusual time? All right, anybody want to take that? Work on that? Go ahead, Nancy.
I don't have the answer, but I have certainly been grappling with this question for the past, how many months have we been in this now? And so I think that for me, having the space to be able to re-envision what we do for this moment is really important. And but that's a difficult shift, not only for the public that you're presenting to, but also for artists who are sort of used to doing things one way. And so I'll tell you, one of the initiatives that I started this year is called the Alliance for Social Action Performance in the theater department. And we are exploring different platforms for presenting our performative message, I guess is the best way to explain it. And our first project called Black Lives Scripted is inspired by something that was done by a class of mine last spring. And we're using Instagram as our platform for both performance and messaging. So I think that I don't have the answer to this, but I know that I'm not interested in more than what I am interested in. So I feel like doing a lot of performances on Zoom is not going to serve the community in the way we want it to. It may serve us as artists. So I think we still have to dig deep to find out, at least for theater artists, what do people need right now? I think about those people marooned in the 37 flood. They didn't need a Shakespeare play. They needed a vaudeville artist to come out and sing and dance and really entertain them and take them away for a moment. So for me, that's the parallel that I'm still grappling with, is how can we really serve people and what they need as in this moment as theater artists.
I think that to piggyback on what Nancy is saying, I think that is the struggle for artists and organizations right now. The one thing I will say, and I had meant to include this, there are some organizations in Kentucky who are doing some interesting things online. Of course, a lot of us are spending so much time online right now, and it's hard to make room for additional online time for enjoyment. I think that that's a challenge that we're going to beginning to face as we move forward. But one of the children's theaters in both Lexington and Louisville actually responded to the crisis and offering their content online and also meeting patrons where they were, essentially, taking into consideration that moms and dads are losing jobs and schools are shutting down and everybody's trying to figure out what the heck is going on at the same time. The Lexington Children's Theater, I was especially impressed with, very quickly pivoted and started offering content online. They even were able to offer their summer workshops online too, their teaching workshops with kids. So there are organizations who have switched to online work, and it's working, but they're still not able to offer anything normally. Now what we do see in the state with non-performing arts organizations like galleries, especially fine art galleries and museums, they are able to reopen in some capacity, not like before, of course, because we're still all operating under restrictions, but there are some opportunities for people to go participate in the arts if they feel comfortable at this time. I think that the challenge is, whether people do feel comfortable and what is available to them where they are. I think that that's extremely difficult for people right now.
If I could just jump in, what I would just add to all of this is that I think artists to a large extent spend, I don't know, it depends on the artist. We spend 70 to 80% of our time pre-performance, pre-publication, pre-presentation, pre-everything. So much of what we're doing is behind the scenes, developing the craft, rehearsing, engaging with each other. So if arts organizations can find a way to be continuing to support the work that's being done, behind the scenes, that's not presented because it's unsafe for an audience to attend. And even if they are presented through this media of Zoom, we all know it's not the same as being in the same room as an orchestra or the same room with that actor when they're speaking their lines. It doesn't work. But the work that the actors and the musicians can be doing behind the scenes, as they're doing in the University of Kentucky College of Fine Arts and in other places, to kind of continue their development as artists, I think we have to really remember that that's important. And again, that's what Holly Flanagan was sort of saying in 1937. She goes, these folks are not working. I want to give them an opportunity to work, either to be present to an audience, and that's great, but even just to give them a chance to be in a rehearsal room and to keep practicing their craft so that they don't get rusty, but also so they continue their further development.
And now we have lots of questions. we went from, it's always, feast or famine. So what I think I'm going to do is group two more questions on performance, and then just make sure that we have the question about politics, make sure we come back to that. But there are two questions about performance. Jane Williams says, what do you think it will take to re-engage people in the arts, theater, playing music in amateur groups, buying tickets and season tickets, after we can safely re-engage with the arts? There will be so much to do with jobs, families, schools, etc. When it is safe to go places and be with people. How to get arts on the priority list? That's one question. Then the second arts question is, there are strong indicators that there's going to be a large economic division among the US public for some period of time as a result of COVID. How do you see this affecting access to the arts when things reopen, so that there's equal access for everyone in the community? And that's from Lori Meadows. So maybe we could take those two kind of access returning questions, and then we have a question about politics. Anybody want to tackle those two, the questions from Jane and Lori?
So in the question from Jane, one of the things, I was in a conversation last week, and that came up. How do we get people back when they come back? And so the topic became consumer confidence, and the steps that organizations, then this was especially about organizations, can take to rebuild consumer confidence. And things as simple as having signage that tells people what they've done to mitigate risks for COVID, really good signage, giving lots of clear instructions on what is expected of audience members when they're here, where you can sit, how many people can be there, letting people know how seriously the venue is taking, what has happened and what they have done to mitigate the risks. And of course, one of the things that is my personal interest, and in fact, this is on our YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and look up the Kentucky Arts Council, we did a webinar last week about reopening safety. And one of the big topics, and it's one of the topics that I, as a consumer, will be looking for to be addressed going forward, is about ventilation, because it plays such a large role in the dispersion of COVID-19. So what steps have been taken to address those kinds of things when you want an audience to come back in? So I think that that's a conversation that is going to need to evolve. The consumer confidence conversation will have to play a large role in reopening to get people to feel comfortable going back in, because I don't know about you all, but I don't feel comfortable going to a whole lot of places right now. Just some thoughts. Thank you.
Other thoughts on this question?
I wonder, in part, if this can be a matter of gradual, it's scale, and a matter of gradual scale. I'm currently enjoying live performance in some very controlled ways, in which a small community, maybe 15 of us at most, is playing together outside, traditional Kentucky fiddle tunes. It's not, something that we rehearse for 6 months and have to create sets or, read music for a symphonic performance, but it is a community that comes together on a weekly basis. A little bit, let me make the analogy of the schools that are having pods with smaller groups of students. And this is the scale with which people are comfortable, smaller group performances. I'm doing this at Renfro Valley at the Kentucky Music Museum, performances for a very small audience, and it reaches a larger audience because of the the video and social media and all of that. But still, they're live performances on a small scale, and I think if we begin with smaller groups where people are following COVID protocol against larger gatherings, then eventually larger scale events can take place after people feel comfortable with those. Obviously, filling Singletary Center for a philharmonic is vastly different than having 20 people playing together in a socially distanced circle at Rock House Brewing. But arts are taking place in a live way in a number of places right now. And I think people feel comfortable with it, but it's a matter of scale.
Mm-hmm. Nancy, you had wanted to join in here?
Well, I think that the key to this is relevance. And to be honest, the theater crowd, and I'm only speaking about the theater crowd right now, has been very, has not always done a great job of that, even in the past 10 to 15 years. What's great about being a university theater department is that we have to make sure we're interesting our audience, which is college students. Primarily college students, not the community. So we have the responsibility of building an audience for the future. So I think everyone is going to have to sort of reevaluate who do they want in their theater and what are they going to do to bring them in that's relevant to them. And so that I think there's going to be a big shifting around of how seasons are created.
Karen, could I just jump in quickly?
Sure.
I'll be brief. But I agree with everything that's been said, especially Nancy's comment about relevance. I think that's going to draw people back. I think there will be a natural desire to go back once we are in a safe place, because I think that's just the desire among humans to congregate together. We've seen this down through the centuries. It's when these theaters reopen, even going back to the Greeks and all along, folks are happy to congregate together there. It's happening in restaurants right now, but the whole point is that people are going to be drawn to it once they feel it's safe. But on to the question of the economics of all of this, I do think that when we build back better and we reimagine where we're going back to, there have to be new efforts made to bring in new audience, like again, along the lines of what Nancy was just saying. And I think that can come through funding, that you basically say in your tax dollars coming out of Kentucky Arts Council or coming out of any arts organization, if I'm giving to you as an arts organization, I want to be sure, one, that you're giving access to folks who, giving free tickets away to, to folks who will not be able to pay, make sure that you have low prices that are available for a variety of communities that can't afford it, and then do whatever you need to do with the other pricing. Scaling the pricing is one way of doing it, and attracting larger audiences, and really evaluating on a year-to-year basis how many people you're bringing in, how diverse is your community that you're actually providing entertainment to and providing arts to. And I think that should be part of the evaluation process, rather than, the tendency of the arts is that it's very elitist, and it tends to sort of scale up to an older white middle class audience. And that's just got to change if it's going to survive, especially going as we go forward into the 21st century.
Thank you so much. So we have time for, there are two questions, and we're going to try to get them both in. We might go a minute or two over, but we'll try to get them both in. So the first one is from Matt Fenton, who's interested in how do the issues of socialism during the time of the New Deal, or the charges of socialism, parallel our current issues? And here, meaning, was the political rift particularly similar to today, or is it different than what's going on today? I think that's a really good question. And then Lori Whitmire. Lori, great to see that you're here. And you have a wonderful teacher's question. Of all the material that was developed as a result of the WPA's endeavors, what one play, book, piece of music, artwork would each of you recommend that be shared with students, this is college level students, to help them understand the link between the two times of crisis? So those are two great questions, and let everybody take a stab at both of them.
Karen, I'll take Matt's question, if I may.
Sure.
Which is a sort of an interesting comparison, I think, or parallel between what happens to the Federal Theater Project and the attacks on it and some of the other programs, because there are men and women of the cultural left and the political left who become parts of, or employed by these programs. They're socialists, they're members of the Communist Party, the John Reed clubs, and this allows Martin Dies, who's kind of a crass opportunist when it comes to condemning the New Deal, to exploit this. But what Dies and the critics are really upset about these programs is the way they embrace the labor movement, this notion of a kind of a proletarian moment, and the sense of racial fairness and racial justice. And the fact that there are people of the left who are active, particularly in the New York City units, this makes them vulnerable, and they can take advantage of this in congressional hearings. And it puts Hallie Flanagan and others in a very difficult position. It's not unlike what you see with Antifa or Antifa or whatever it is, that this notion of this expansive conspiracy of the left and tainting Black Lives Matter, any number of other social movements today committed to social justice. It immediately makes them seem radical, un-American, dangerous, and something that has to be stamped out. So I think there's an interesting connection there.
I
have a recommendation for Lori. Are we going to continue on with Matt's question?
No, go ahead. We could do
Lori,
both.
there is one of the Living Newspapers plays, which was I think the penultimate play for the Cincinnati unit, was called, I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, Spirochete. And it's a play about syphilis, its history, its spread, the taboos surrounding it, and the prevention of the disease. So it's really timely, and you can find a lot of information on the Library of Congress website that shows production handbooks, playbills, And the playbills for these living newspapers were really interesting and beautiful because they looked like a newspaper. They were printed like a newspaper with articles that illuminated how the story or the play was impacting their city, whatever city the play was being done. So Spirochete is the one I think for the moment.
Herman?
I would jump in and piggyback on that with what Nancy said. Spirochete, I think, was good. There's any number of living newspaper plays that I think, depending on the subject matter of your class, you kind of could choose from. Spirochete, Power, which was about the TVA and about the Tennessee Valley Authority, if you're interested in how electricity was developed. It's a beautiful play. It's really smart. It even begins with a blackout, and then just they come in with flashlights. It's really kind of cool to talk about what power is and how it works. This 1/3 of a Nation, if you're dealing with housing crisis issues, I think those are really helpful. And I was just looking at 1/3 of a Nation last night. In the document itself, it has like a 4-page bibliography to start off with. Literally, here are all our sources all the way through. So it's really a good thing. If those of us who are interested in documentary drama, that's really helpful. But the only other thing I would sort of riff on the question coming from Matt and David Hamilton's response is what I think the distinction between now and then. One, I think the opposition is exactly the same. I think it's rather conservative forces. They're exactly and have the same kind of agendas pushing back against the changes that were being put forward. But what was different then was that FDR was putting in place notions that were considered to be socialistic, and they were. Eugene V. Debs had run in 1912 on the notion of Social Security, and then he puts in Social Security in 1933, 34. And then you go forward with a bunch of other programs and regulations of the government that were put in place during this era. And many of these plays were actually even kind of supportive of them. You could argue some of these plays were kind of like propaganda for the government's programs. Flash forward to now we're talking about defending just those programs rather than creating them and making them new. They're already established, and then there's the onslaught to get rid of them. So in many ways, if you think about topics and things that could be done, if there's a new administration, plays that kind of embrace the old New Deal, and then whatever happens under the next administration to kind of reform our country, that might be the smart thing to do. I know film and television will do this, but I think theater should do it as well.
Hey, Karen, can I just pick up just quickly? Herman mentioned the Tim Robbins movie, The Cradle Will Rock, which isn't really a great movie, but it's really interesting if you want to find out about the Federal Theater Project and how it worked and some of what it confronted. That's a great movie to pick. I don't know if it's on Netflix or not. I've got a DVD of it someplace. But and as far as my suggestion here, I don't know if you can see this. It's the WPA Guide to Kentucky. It is not a great book, but it's really a wonderful snapshot of Kentucky in the 1930s. And you get a kind of a sense of how these projects worked, their strengths and weaknesses from digging into some of this. And if you teach Kentucky history, this is really interesting to look into.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from our panelists? This has been such a delightful panel. I'm sorry to wrap it up, but we're already a few minutes late over time. However, I'd be happy if anybody wants to have a last word or a last suggestion for Lori. All right, well, thank you so very much. I really enjoyed this panel. Thank you to our audience for coming, for attending. And I very much hope that we will continue these conversations in the future because clearly there's a lot of work to be done to help the arts and to help the community during this crisis.